In an increasingly chaotic world, are efforts to combat illegal drugs and other crimes having the desired effect? Ambassador William Brownfield confidently says yes. He'll discuss it next on Global Perspectives.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. Illegal drugs, organized crime, corruption, those subjects are part of a daily conversation for Ambassador William Brownfield. He heads the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. Welcome to the show, Ambassador Brownfield.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Your office sounds like a lot of trouble. Do you ever escape it at the end of the day?
Well, let's just say I am now 62 years old. I've been doing this job for 3.5 years, so obviously I have escaped it enough to survive.
Tell us about the mission of your office.
Sure. The Bureau has been around for about 40 years. It started life as an organization dedicated to international drug control issues because U.S. law enforcement did not, in the 1970s, have the authority to operate overseas, and USAID, our nation's development organization, did not have the authority to support law enforcement operations. So we started life in the 1970s doing counter-narcotics. Since then, we have added 3 additional missions over the last 3 decades. First, we expanded to cover all sorts of international crime, the thinking being that drugs are not the only issue, criminal issue affecting the United States of America. Then we expanded to direct support for international police. And finally, within the last 10 years, we have expanded our mission to cover all issues related to rule of law, not just police, but also prosecutors, defense attorneys, courts, judges, and correction systems.
I've been listening to conversations about the, quote, war on drugs my entire adult life. Was it ever really a war? And if it is, are we winning?
No, that's a very fair question. And may I tell you that when I believe it was an expression coined by then President Richard Nixon, when he chose to call it a war on drugs, I, who was only in high school at the time, probably should have stood up and said, this is a poor choice of words. It is not a war. We don't make war on our own citizens. We don't make war on our own communities because that is where the drug problem is located. It is a matter of criminal justice on one side and public health on the other. And you have to be dealing with both, whether domestically or overseas, because if you don't, simply stated, you're going to fail.
Tell us about the drug problem originating from Latin America and the Caribbean. That seems to have been the source of so much of what ends up on the streets here.
Sure. And in fact, if the truth be told, it is the overwhelming source of foreign-produced illicit drugs that come to the United States. There are other countries, Afghanistan specifically, that produce a tremendous amount of heroin and opium, but very, very little of that comes to the United States. Most of the cocaine, the heroin, and the foreign-produced methamphetamines that come to the United States do in fact come from Latin America. We started life in the early 1970s focused on the Andean region of Latin America, and specifically Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, source of nearly 100% of the world's coca and cocaine. And as the large multinational drug trafficking organizations developed greater expertise and moved from cocaine to methamphetamine to heroin, the number of countries affected by them obviously changed as well. We started what I would call a specific effort addressed or focused on addressing the issues of cocaine production in the late 1990s with the so-called Plan Colombia. One of the impacts of Plan Colombia and its success, and it has been successful, it has reduced cocaine production in Colombia by more than 50%. It has reduced cocaine consumption in the United States by nearly 50%. But one of the impacts of that has been the expansion of these previous cocaine trafficking cartels or organizations into other countries in the hemisphere. First, Mexico, which generated the so-called Merida Initiative of 2007. Then Central America, generating what we call CARSI, the Central America Regional Security Initiative. And ojo, as we look ahead to the next 2 to 4 years, watch the Caribbean, because just as narcotics trafficking organizations moved from Colombia to Mexico in response to international efforts, and Mexico to Central America, so I predict will they move to new trafficking locations as a result of our focus on Central America. And when they make that decision, their old networks and their old roots in the Caribbean will look very attractive.
And this has happened before in terms of dealing with the drug trade. You have stricter enforcement on in one particular area, then they shift their routes to another area,
Sure.
so the Caribbean.
It's what we call the balloon effect, and the truth of the matter is, and it's a true metaphor. You squeeze the balloon at one side, and the air is going to move into some other location. The long-term solution, obviously, is a matter of education, treatment, rehabilitation. In other words, convincing populations of the logic that it is not a good thing to use and abuse certain drugs. It's a matter of public health. It's a matter of enforcement across the board, which is to say not just 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 governments enforcing their drug policies, but all of the nations of the world doing it in a collective and consensual manner.
Let's talk about marijuana for a moment. There's been some press coverage in recent times about the apparent or suggested changing of the U.S. international policy on marijuana. What's that about?
Yep. Actually, thanks for the question, because it may be right now the most topical question related to drugs in the entire United States of America. And I would suggest that there hasn't been a change. What there has been is exactly what President Obama announced at the conclusion of the Summit of the Americas in Cartagena, Colombia in the year 2012, when, in response to questions from the media and some suggestions from other presidents from the Western Hemisphere about taking another look at, reviewing, changing, adjusting our hemispheric drug policy, President Obama said, while we ourselves do not believe legalization will work in the United States to solve these problems, we welcome the debate. And for the last 2.5 years, I would suggest we've been having a very good international debate. I would suggest that only in the month of September, all of the governments of the Americas, including the United States of America, met in Guatemala, where we reviewed our hemispheric drug policy. And we came up with a declaration that emphasized some basic points. 1, public health. 2, the importance of balance in your criminal justice policies and programs. And 3rd, the importance of maintaining consensus in resisting the transnational criminal organizations, not those who buy or consume illicit product, but those who traffic in it on a very large scale, using violence and blood in order to make money in the trafficking of the product. I thought it was a pretty good special session of the OAS. The debate now will move to the United Nations. There are, in a sense, 2 extremes in this debate, John, if I could suggest. One extreme, and we've heard from them a great deal over the last 40 or 50 years, are what I would call the strict prohibitionists, those who say we must prohibit everything and bring all of the authority of the law upon those who violate these prohibitions. At the other extreme are those that I call the legalizers, those who offer the somewhat simplistic argument that if only we legalized all of these illicit drugs, the problem would just go away. No more crime, no more violence, and apparently no one would have health issues related to the legalization of the product. My own guess is these 2 extremes represent maybe 10% of the world's population at each extreme, and the 80% of the world's population in between has to figure out where we want to come down. And may I suggest to you, as the guy responsible for the international aspects of this debate, we've got to find a policy that all governments, or at least the overwhelming majority, can accept. From those governments that believe that drug trafficking should be subjected to the most extreme legal sanctions, up to and including in some countries capital punishment, to governments at the opposite extreme who actually do support substantial legalization, like the Republic of Uruguay, which recently legalized the production, sale, purchase, and consumption of marijuana throughout the entire country. What we need is some policy that can be accepted by all of them, and that's our challenge.
You mentioned Afghanistan earlier. We've mounted a massive effort to combat illegal drugs in Afghanistan. I've seen recent press reports that suggest that production of poppy is up considerably. Is that correct, or is there a context that's necessary here?
A slight correction in terms of what the cited report says, and then some context for it. The report, which was a report by the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, noted that cultivation of opium poppy has increased. And even there, what they literally noticed was that the number of acres where opium poppy was being cultivated has grown. But the production of heroin has actually not grown substantially. What has really happened in factual terms is, as pressure was brought to bear on certain of the traditional growing areas in Afghanistan, the growers and the trafficking organizations that support them have moved farther away into less fertile area. So what you literally have is more territory that is under cultivation, but with lower yields, so it is producing less opium poppy than fields of that size in more fertile areas. May I offer a couple of thoughts on the point? One, a reminder to everyone that's listening to this program, Afghanistan produces a tiny, tiny percentage of the heroin that is being consumed in the United States of America today. I don't say it with great pride. The truth of the matter is the overwhelming majority of heroin that is consumed in America comes from Latin America. We estimate somewhat less than 4% of U.S. consumed heroin comes from Afghanistan. Second, a lesson that I learned from my Colombia experience, both managing our support for Plan Colombia from Washington and then 3 years as the U.S. ambassador to Colombia, is that counter-narcotics programs take time. We get into this mess over a process of generations, and it's going to be more than just a month or two or even a year or two to solve the problem. Third lesson that we have learned is you've got to address all aspects of the problem. It is not just the cultivation of coca or opium poppy. You also have to address consumption in the country where the stuff is being produced. You have to do interdiction as well as eradication. You have to have the ability to influence the criminal financial transactions that allow the organizations to make money. You must attack and interfere with their ability to use the chemicals that eventually produce the heroin or the cocaine that is eventually delivered to market. In other words, you can't just focus on one link of the chain. You have to focus on the entire chain. And finally, the ultimate lesson from our experience in Latin America, the government itself must demonstrate the political will to attack the problem. And this isn't often easy. May I suggest to you, John, one of the reasons why there is such difficulty, and there is difficulty in Afghanistan, is that there is still a serious security problem in Afghanistan. And to encourage a subsistence farmer to stop growing opium poppy and to grow wheat instead, if he is told by the local Taliban commander that if he does that, he'll be killed and his entire family will be killed as well, it does complicate the process of narcotics control and counter-narcotics efforts. So my response in terms of Afghanistan is think long-term, not short-term. Think of building institutions rather than eradicating specific numbers of acres of opium poppy. And think about all aspects of the issue and not just a matter of cultivation.
In Latin America in the 1980s and 90s, alternatives such as crop substitution held a lot of promise, especially for the Andean region. How much of a solution is that today? Is it a big part of the solution, or where exactly does that lie?
I would suggest that alternative development is part of the solution, but it would be a mistake to say that alternative development is the solution. What we learned in places like Colombia in the 1980s and the 1990s is that alternative development programs, and by alternative development, I mean not just give them a barrel of seeds and tell them to go out and plant something other than coca or opium poppy, but give them the tools as well, give them some degree of training, allow them the schools, the clinics, the roads, the water supply and electrical supply, so that they have some stake in the future of the community, some reason to want to grow corn or wheat or coffee rather than coca or opium poppy. And even a sophisticated program like that works only when the security situation allows the government, whatever the government may be, whether it's the government of Colombia or Peru or Bolivia or the government of Afghanistan or Burma, only when the government actually has sufficient security on the ground for the community will the program work. When you have alternative development as part of a broader range of tools in your toolbox, when you have security on the ground, and when you have a government that is sufficiently committed so that it is willing to dedicate both the personnel resources, people, police, advisors, and supporters, as well as the monetary resources, because alternative development is not free, it's not even cheap, that's when it works. And that, in my opinion, is why coca cultivation in Colombia has reduced nearly 60% since the year 2004.
Your Bureau has partnership building responsibilities, including with law enforcement worldwide. Tell us a little bit about your efforts in that area.
Yep. May I say that, that right here in Orlando, the city of Orlando and its police department served as the host of the largest international law enforcement conference that is held any given year. That is the conference of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, where somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 senior law enforcement officials gather and work through not just kind of specific organizational issues, but matters of training and doctrine and procedures and operations, the sort of stuff that allows law enforcement both within the United States and among all of the 190, I think it's 196 nations represented in the United Nations today, to gather and compare notes and discuss how to proceed. We try to be part of this, the INL Bureau of the Department of State. First, because it is among our missions the support of building modern, professional, honest, and transparent law enforcement communities around the world. Not just because we are a wonderful bunch of men and women in the INL Bureau, but because we have learned the hard way that it is impossible for the United States of America to manage international criminal threats if it does not have competent, trained, resourced partners in the countries from which those threats are coming.
Tell us about the organized crime challenge worldwide. It seems that economic downturns are often breeding grounds for crime. Has this been true during the recent Great Depression or Great Recession?
It has. And may I say to you that organized crime, or what I guess we now call TOC, or transnational organized crime, is probably going to be one of our major challenges for the 21st century. And I say it this way. Over the last 30 years, we, the United States government, but quite frankly, the entire international law enforcement community, has gotten pretty good at two things. One is counterterrorism. how we organize, what our tactics are, how we share information and intelligence to deal with the terrorist threat. And we've gotten pretty good at it, particularly since September 11th of 2001. The other area where we have developed considerable expertise is drugs. And the truth of the matter is we are well organized. We have reasonable resources. We understand how to do the counter-drug mission. Falling in between those two is this big, I'll use the technical term, this big blob of criminal activity, which for want of a better word, we'll call it transnational organized crime. And it does in fact cover a tremendous number of issues. It's trafficking, it's smuggling, it's also trafficking in persons. It's cybercrime, it's financial crime and penetration into financial systems. It's corruption in all of its various manifestations. And may I suggest to you that just as we in the United States and our international partners have figured out, have spent a tremendous amount of time developing the systems by which we cooperate, share information, and do joint activities for drugs and terrorism, we're going to have to develop that same skill set for larger transnational organized crime. It's a challenge for the future, and may I tell you that I say to my people, at least once a week, to their intense frustration and annoyance, that we have got to get focused on TUC, because that is going to be where the American people are going to be expecting results from us over the next 15 to 20 years.
We've all been asked to do more with less in recent years, and government at the federal level is no exception. Relative to the challenge that you face globally in all of the areas that you've been discussing, is the size of your organization and its budget adequate to meet the challenge?
Dr. B, I'm going to, you're putting me in a difficult spot, of course, because by definition, I support whatever budget request the President of the United States makes to the United States Congress, and I accept, having carefully read Article 1 of the United States Constitution, whatever decision the United States Congress makes about my budget. I will offer you the following factual information. My budget has reduced by nearly 50%, that's 50%, over the last 4 years. Now, part of this was the reduction in our police training program in Iraq, which, by the way, may be on its way back up again. I don't know. We'll see how that drama plays out. But much of it came out of core programs related to drugs, police, international organized crime, and rule of law. And while obviously I accept whatever resources are made available to me, and obviously I accept whatever decisions the constitutional organs of government of the United States of America finally make in terms of resources and budget, I make as well the rather obvious comment that if fewer resources are made available, there will be less that we can accomplish overseas. That's the trade-off, and it's a tough trade-off. And I don't mean to make this sound too simple or even simplistic. At the end of the day, the decision makers have to decide how much for drugs and how much for, I don't know, education or health care or infrastructure repair and development. I don't mean to suggest that these are easy questions, but I do mean to suggest that a 50% reduction over a 4-year period of time means we're doing 50% less in terms of the impact we're having with these programs in other countries.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today, Ambassador Brownfield.
I've enjoyed it very much. Thanks to you and your entire listening audience.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.